is Angela Guerrero-Gonzalez, and I'm from the QT School of Architecture and Built Environment. And I'll be presenting preliminary insights. I can't stress that enough. These are preliminary insights from a study we're currently conducting in the Mulgrave-Russell catchment on the role of social networks on practice adoption. And before I start, I would like to acknowledge the Jagera and Turrbal people as the traditional custodians of Meanjin, the lands from where I'm presenting today. And I extend that acknowledgement to all the custodians of the Great Barrier Reef, including the traditional custodians of the region where this study was conducted or is being conducted, and to any First Nations people present today. Okay, so the background here is water quality improvement. We know that in the GBR, we know that that's a key policy focus. And we know that achieving those targets depend on farmers' adoption of recommended practices. And so really we need to understand farmers' decision-making processes to make sure that the programs we're designing are effective and the policies that we're designing are effective. And so the knowledge that we are going here is that while practice adoption in the GBR has primarily been studied through economic and psychological lenses, and there's been a lot in that front being produced, some studies, even some of those studies have suggested that peer influence on social learning played crucial roles in adoption, and the speaker just before also highlighted that. But we actually lack a clear understanding of how farmer social networks influence the adoption of agricultural practices in the GBR. So that's our knowledge gap. And this study forms part of a bigger project trying to understand how human networks across multiple scales influence practice adoption. So very much a system scale understanding of human networks. But the GBR study focuses on the local networks that influence practice adoption, and also some of the links to regional levels and across to the governance scales as well. And the three key questions we're addressing is, first of all, how do different types of relationships across local and regional scales influence changes in farming practices? And what social networks are interlinked with economic activity, and how this influence land management decisions. And the third one, social networks, what social networks are important for cane growers in making decisions about fertilizer use. So that's a lot more specific. And that we're not quite there yet. We need a bigger data set for that. So today I'll be speaking more to the first two questions. I'm going to jump that. We actually don't need that. Okay, so in terms of the methodology, we're conducting in-depth interviews with cane growers in the Mulgrave-Russell region. We've gone through the first stage. We've conducted 17 interviews earlier in the year, and we are hoping to conduct some more next year, early next year. Right, so a little bit on the sample, but I'm going to actually jump that, go through that very quickly. So the main tool that we're using to conduct these in-depth interviews is net maps. So we're using that as a tool to generate discussion about the networks that growers have. And so we start by asking them to map the individuals with whom they communicate about farming practices. We use that to elicit the type of interactions they have with them. And we use that to start a conversation about those interactions and the hope to evoke participants' practice adoption processes. So these can be quite lengthy interviews. And also we try to identify the different types of relationships that are embedded in farming practice and adoption processes. So that's an example of one of the ones we collected, but they all look very different. So the first question we asked to kickstart this net mapping exercise is, who do you talk to about land management practices? So from only that initial data, we can have a look at not only who is in their network in terms of the types of organizations and individuals, but also their size of the network. So for this particular sample, we have an average of 10 people in grower social networks, but they can be as small as 3 and as large as 21. For this particular sample. So we think that this sample we have is a little bit biased in terms of the recruitment strategy that we use, and we're trying to correct that in the next stage. So these might actually look very different at the end. All right, so we also collecting a lot of information about the composition of those networks, the organization, etc. But I chose to focus on this concept today. So, in order to address the question of how social networks influence land management decisions and practice adoption, we needed to dig a little bit deeper. And to help us do this, we use the concept of relational embeddedness. So, this is a little bit of theory, so bear with me. This concept is rooted in social network theory and sociology, has been applied to understanding mainly economic networks. And so it highlights the idea that individuals and organizations who are conducting economic activities are not isolated entities, but are deeply embedded in a web of social relationships. And the network ties they have exist in a continuum from market-based exchange on the left to relational-based exchange on the right, depending on the extent to which a tie is embedded within a social relationship. And why this is important is that the research on this concept shows that the relationally embedded ties have the potential to influence the economic decision-making of the individual more so than those market-based exchange relationships. And so the way they do that is can be directly through influencing choices, but also through the increasing of social capital. So we applied this concept in our study, but not to understand, obviously, not economic network ties, but the network that growers used to communicate about farming practices, which is what the data we collected. And the way we operationalized it was by using the net maps to asking participants to discuss in more detail the relationships they have with each of the individuals in their network. So we presented them with a description of the different types of relationships that are those there on the left, that could exist based on a typology of embedded types developed in social network theory. And we've adapted that typology to our context, of course. And as you can see, so each one of those columns represent a participant. And you can see that the relational embeddedness of their ties is quite high. So all of those on the left are quite, take a big proportion of their network, and only the bottom one is the sort of more transactional or market-based type of relationships, and we take a smaller proportion. For some participants, that's a little bit larger. And this is an important finding because according to the theory, relationship-based ties are more likely to influence, of course, land management decisions than those purely more transactional ones. I'm gonna jump that, don't have time for it, sadly. But I didn't want to talk about this. So we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into that finding and get more insight on the types of relationships or relational embedded ties that influence and how they can influence practice adoption. So we did a qualitative analysis of transcripts, so we're still doing that at the moment, and we've identified some narratives of adoption. And we then applying
2 minutes.
Great. So we're applying this other concept, theoretical concept of simple versus complex contagion. And so the idea behind this is that many things are spread through simple contagion. So when where only one single exposure or a small amount of exposure is needed. So things like spreading information, sharing a meme online, or spreading disease like COVID, or even some behaviors like driving behavior can be identified as a simple contagion. But there are certain sources of resistance to some contagions that make them not simple but complex. And so these four are some of them, which I'm not going to explain all of them now, but we, in our analysis, we've found evidence so far for the last one, which is that of credibility. And this is the idea that adopters act as sources of social proof for an innovation. So when this social proof is needed, you are facing a complex contagion. So in the context of adoption of farming practice, this relates to making sure the practice is effective, that it's actually going to do what it's supposed to do, that it's not going to have detrimental impacts, etc., etc. And so when you are in presence of complex contagion, multiple exposures to a practice are required before it is adopted. And it also needs social confirmation from multiple sources that that practice is effective. And according to the theory, the answer to overcome any of these barriers is social reinforcement.
30 seconds.
Thank you. We looked for social reinforcement in our data, and we found so far, and cross-referencing that with the types of relationally embedded ties, and we found some evidence for social reinforcement from peers, from family members, and from trusted individuals in some of the adoptions that these farmers are doing. You probably won't have time to read all of that, but these are some examples. And just in the last few seconds, I wanted to talk about some implications for water quality programs that are starting to come through. The first one is that increasing information and extension services is clearly, or it's not necessarily clearly, but it's indicative there are those that is not enough. We do definitely need information and extension services, but the adoption requires reinforcement. So creating opportunities for repeated contact with individuals who have already adopted is key. But the way to do that is not necessarily by creating single bridges, like in network theory, usually talk about central actors and bridging actors linking different groups. For complex contagion, that actually might not work, and you might need to create like wide bridges and close relationships for that contagion to actually work. And one of the strategies could be focusing perhaps on peripheral individuals in the network rather than the central ones, because the central ones have a lot more ties. And if those people they're connected to are non-adopters, that's going to be a problem in terms of social reinforcement. So maybe the initiation of the contagion could, the theory says it could happen, or it has a better chance in the periphery. So this will be an interesting thing to look at more as we continue our analysis. And the last point there is paying attention to these relationship embedded ties, which are clearly prevalent in at least this particular region. I think that's it. I just finished with some acknowledgements here and look forward to your questions.